Hi everyone, I'm Carl Lund. My paper for this course was called Atari, Commodore, and the 1980s Home Computer Wars. The research question answered by the paper was, what role did the companies Atari and Commodore play in the home computer revolution of the 1970s and 1980s? This is a very significant topic. Computers today are everywhere, but that was not always the case. Atari and Commodore both played key roles in popularizing home computers. By extension, they popularized personal computers. And the difference between a home computer and a personal computer isn't really a valid difference today, but it was a huge issue in the 1980s and 1990s. A home computer at first was thought of solely as a hobbyist device, as little more than a toy. But a personal computer, as opposed to either a home computer or a business computer, was a machine for multiple purposes. It was the idea that computers could be used in the home, in the workplace, in education, and elsewhere. Although the machines released by Atari and Commodore are often called home computers, particularly their 8-bit machines, their machines, especially their later 16-bit machines, are true personal computers. They had many roles to play in many different settings. Key primary sources for this research included the magazine Compute, the Journal for Progressive Computing. Compute was one of the dominant computer publications during the 1980s and late 1970s. It was generally aimed at a general user, sort of an educated non-specialist, you might say. The two major competitors of the time that survived for the entire period, and indeed into the 1990s, were Byte and InfoWorld. In my opinion, Byte is aimed at more advanced users, and InfoWorld is aimed more at business users. And the differentiation between those publications is something that sort of evolved over time. In my opinion, Compute is one of the best, most readable, most reliable sources for news of that era. And Compute covered the news of the computer market, especially the home computer market. That was part of its bread and butter. Its reports about new computers released at the Consumer Electronics Show or announced at the Consumer Electronics Shows that were held in Chicago every summer and Las Vegas every winter. Their news about the crises that the market faced, especially in 1983, 84, and 85, are really important in understanding this time period and understanding how the businesses of the period were reacting. Another really important primary source was memoir by Michael Tomczyk, which was released in 1984, called The Home Computer Wars. And Tomczyk worked for Jack Tramiel, Commodore's founder, at Commodore. And so the book was an account, which critics called an expose, of Commodore under Jack Tramiel throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. And the book is, of course, a person's personal account and personal reminiscences, so their biases have to be taken into account. But I think it played a really important role in understanding the corporate culture, particularly of Commodore, which was, as I mentioned, founded by Jack Tramiel. And Tramiel would go on in 1984 to leave Commodore, not necessarily by his choice. The evidence there is contradictory, and go on to buy Atari. And that ties into the research findings. Commodore created what is arguably the second most popular computer of the late 1970s, the Commodore PET. It would go on under Jack Tramiel to release the Commodore 64, which was the best-selling computer of all time, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Atari also released several important personal computers in 1979, even though we tend to think of it as a video game company. But the Atari 400 and 800, particularly the 800, was an advanced personal computer for its time that was incredibly powerful. By 1984, though, Atari was losing $1 million a day. Its owner, Warner Communications, was desperate to get rid of it, but they also wanted to sell it to someone who had a chance of righting the ship. They chose Jack Tramiel, who had recently left Commodore. And this is ironic because Jack Tramiel's price wars are a big part of the reason why Atari was floundering. The second half of the 1980s, once Tramiel took over Atari, saw really an international battle between Commodore and Atari for the home computer market, fought primarily between the two companies' remarkable 16-bit computers, the Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST, both of which were far more powerful than Apple's Macintoshes of the time. Both Atari and Commodore failed in the marketplace by the 1990s, but the machines have important legacies. The ST in music, the Amiga in video production, and both of them in making advanced technology affordable to a wide variety of users.